Next one. Yeah. Next slide, David. We are just delighted that, oops, looks like my video didn't start. There we go. So we are just delighted today to continue our discussion that we're having about the foreign influence. And we have really a special arrangement for today. We have a joint presentation between Rebecca Kaiser, Jean Feldman, and Michelle Bowles on everything that has happened since the last time we met. And we're really looking forward to seeing that. And then we're also going to have, David, you can go, I think you might need to go backwards on a slide if you want to try that. Yep, other direction. Can you go backwards? That one, that's perfect. So just to share with everybody, sorry, it seems to be jumping. But anyway, we're going to have this joint presentation with Rebecca, Jean, and Michelle. And then we have two working groups that the FDP Foreign Influence Working Group have established. And one is on a key investigator clearinghouse concept, and the other is on a risk assessment and delineation tool. And representatives from both of those groups are here today and want to bring everybody up to date on what exactly those are all about. So you can go forward, David. So one of the things that has brought all this about is this very, very important August 10th post by Dr. Lander that talks about what OSTP is doing to implement NSPM 33. And they made it very clear that they're going to focus over the next 90 days, so basically between August and November, on disclosure policy, on oversight and enforcement, and on research security programs. And so you're going to see basically that these working groups that will information and talking about, well, how do we create effective?
Hey, Pamela.
And before that, Rebecca and Jean and Michelle are.
Pamela, you're digitizing a little bit for me. David, is she digitizing for others?
Jim?
You're digitizing.
Yes, I'm getting it as well.
Okay. Well, it looks fine on my end, so I can't tell. So,
okay.
Jim, do you want to go ahead and finish before, and then we'll launch into Rebecca so
Sure.
it's smooth for people?
And maybe Pamela, you can call in on a landline. That because your voice is just digitizing a little bit behind.
Okay.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Pamela. Next slide, David. So next slide. So as Pamela mentioned, two parts to this. Our friends from NSF and NIH are going to give an update on what's been going on. Rebecca is going to take point, and Jean and Michelle will, I think, do some color commentary, but then there'll be specific opportunity for Q&A at the end. So we are going to reserve somewhere around 10 minutes. We will, Pamela and I will try to manage the chat. So feel free to ask questions. We'll try to catalog them, and we will direct them to Rebecca, Jean, and Michelle at the end. So welcome, Rebecca, Jean, and Michelle. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Jim, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. I'm going to give a bit of an overview of research security and then talk a bit about what we're planning to do for NSPM 33 implementation. Next slide, please. Research security, certainly we want to maintain our robust research ecosystem. And I used to talk about how we wanted to maintain openness, but balance openness with protection. I realize now that it's really, research protection is about the openness of the system and maintaining that openness. There's no contradiction in those terms. to maintain that openness, we have to make sure that we also maintain the integrity of the system, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. I want to emphasize that international collaboration is essential, and that is something that is strongly encouraged, and I'll talk a bit about the difference between principled international collaboration and improper foreign government interference, which is not the same thing. Of course, also, we look at diversity, and that means that we want diverse domestic and international talent. And that's a huge asset to our research and engineering enterprise, and we need to make sure that we maintain that as we go forward in these efforts. Next slide, please. So again, we want to maintain this open and collaborative research environment. Focus on collaborations, both globally and domestically. And focus on research integrity, which is promoting the core norms and principles of openness, transparency, and reciprocal collaboration. Next slide, please. We do have to focus on the risks, and conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment are potential risks, especially when they're not disclosed to one's US employer or to the funding agency. We do expect the proposing and awardee research organization to address and resolve conflicts of interest and report any unresolvable conflicts of interest to us. Conflicts of commitment is defined in National Security Presidential Memorandum 33, and it means having so many commitments to different research projects that it's very challenging to understand how one might have the capacity to do the funding agency project that's proposed, or there might be undue overlap or duplication with that project. We do hope that the proposing research organization is able to resolve conflicts of commitment prior to proposal. NSF and NIH both review, for NSF, current and pending support disclosures, for NIH, other support disclosures, to also look for capacity, duplication, and overlap issues. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about a new term and condition we have at NSF. We implemented it almost a year ago now on submitting post-award information. Breaches to research integrity overall are extremely important. And our UK colleagues use the term trusted research, which I kind of like. What it means is we want to make sure we have integrity in the entire research ecosystem, from researcher individually to the institution, to the lab, to the funding agency and beyond, because we need to be able to trust the ecosystem so that we can trust the research results that come from that. And of course, we want to make sure to maintain our gold standard peer review process and how we make funding decisions. We do need the information in disclosures to make those sound funding decisions. And I'll talk more about that. In our world, it's maybe a new concept to think about national security and economic security when we're thinking about the research we fund. But we do all know that the research and the research contributions of what we fund certainly do contribute to both national and economic security. And therefore, any breaches to it can jeopardize that national and economic security. We need to make sure, of course, we just keep this robust research process so that the results can be made open and available to other researchers to be able to replicate, innovate, and improve upon and challenge. And that's part of our whole system so that innovation occurs. And so it's in all of our interest. And that's why we really want to partner with you to make sure that we focus on these issues together. Next slide, please. Something that I wanted to raise because it's a risk and it's something that we are concerned about. But as of right now, participation by researchers in foreign government talent recruitment programs is allowable by policy and law if disclosed. Now, as we all know, there is pending legislation that might change that, and we're all watching that closely to see how that goes. But no matter what, disclosure is key. And we do, of course, want to make sure that researchers are aware, as well as employee research organizations, that some of these programs do require the researcher to sign contracts that have concerning clauses in them. And as we know, the researchers who sign these, they're employees of a US research organization. This also occurs in other countries as well. And the contracts take the form of an employment contract. And they have requirements in them, such as listing the foreign university affiliation before the US university on publications, even though, again, the researcher might be an employee of the US organization. They require obtaining large amounts of research funding for the foreign university, and often specify a dollar threshold for the amount of money that does need to be obtained. And they also often require the filing of patents registered to the foreign university and not the US entity. And they often specify the number of patents. And so these are some of the clauses that are concerning. We encourage, of course, thorough review of contracts before they're signed by both the researcher as well as by the US funding organization and the research organization, I should say. Next slide, please. So to mitigate risks, of course, we all know that a federal research grant comes with responsibility, and we all need to partner in this effort. The first is, of course, accountability and honesty are key. We are not interested in what might be called clerical errors. We want to make sure that those are addressed and corrected. We are concerned about patterns of behavior, of non-disclosure, or misrepresentation of affiliations and sources of funding. Certainly that's of concern to all of us. We need the information disclosed to us in proposals so that, again, we can make sound funding decisions. You hear this over and over again, but NSF can only fund about 20% of the proposals that come into us. That's largely due to the amount of funding we have. And if we provide an award to someone and it's based on incomplete or incorrect information, it's unfair to those who did appropriately represent everything in their proposal. We do have a term and condition, as I mentioned, that started in October 2020 at NSF, that instructs how to submit post-award information that should have been provided at time of proposal in the current and pending support section. And it instructs how to submit this information. The research organization, the awardee organization, should submit it within 30 days of discovery, along with an assessment of the impacts of that additional information on the capacity of the PI or any overlap or duplication. We have an internal NSF process by which we review that information and will coordinate back with the research organization after that review. So if you have any questions about that, do please feel free to contact me or Jean, and we're happy to discuss it further. We, of course, want to make sure that we have a level playing field where the best ideas and innovations can advance. We focus very much on the confidentiality of the proposals that are submitted to us. And people ask me a lot about how can I say that we're an open system if I'm talking about confidentiality. One's ideas, the ones that are submitted to us, we know that that's like gold, and we want to protect those. And when we fund those ideas, we want to make sure that the researchers have the capability and the authority to publish and open their data results when they feel ready to do so. We want them to do that, but when they feel ready and not any time before. And so we need to make sure that the system is secure enough in that regard. And of course, we do need to make sure we protect against any improper influence or distortion of scientific knowledge. And here is where there really is a good overlap with scientific integrity efforts. And at NSF and NIH, we in research security work hand in hand with scientific integrity folks. Next slide, please. Disclosure. I know many university websites, and we truly appreciate it. They start with saying disclose, disclose, disclose. Thank you. We do need that information. Transparency and full disclosure are essential, as I said, so that we can make sound funding decisions and we can avoid risks. Of course, identifying conflicts of interest and commitment, those are extremely important. We rely again on the research organization to identify and resolve those conflicts. And we use the information to look at capacity overlap and duplication issues. And we, of course, use the disclosed information to assess the qualifications of the team to perform the project, which is in the biosketch portion. We want to make sure the system is fair, and these requirements ensure that. Next slide, please. International collaboration, again, strongly encouraged. I get concerned when I hear that some in the research community are avoiding establishing international collaborations because they're not quite sure where the line is. The line is, if it's an international scientific research collaboration and it's transparent and reciprocal and the mutual benefits can be identified, it's encouraged. We should be able to identify the complementary skills and facilities and resources that are leveraged. It doesn't necessarily need to be a one-for-one exchange of resources or skills. It just needs to be something where it is clear that both sides are actively involved in the research and are benefiting from each other's contributions. Exchange of personnel, when that's possible, again, of course, is also encouraged. And we want to make sure that clear intellectual contributions are identified and that it's clear what the organizational affiliations and sources of funding are there for both sides of the collaboration. We do hear some stories about some US universities where there's an entity that approaches them. They hear about an NSF funded grant. They ask if they can meet with the PI to maybe join that grant. And it's really unclear what that entity is and where they get their funding. For us, that's a sign. That's a sign that, again, that some caution should be taken and some more research should be done before entering into that partnership, because the partnership does benefit the scientific enterprise. So you can see that this reciprocal, beneficial, mutual beneficial collaboration is very different from improper foreign government interference. Next slide, please. So we've been talking about NSPM 33. It was issued in February 2021. And this administration is taking it on to assess ways to best implement this presidential memorandum. And Pamela told you about Eric Lander's blog. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But this NSPM addresses why research security and integrity are important. It outlines their key elements. And it talks about federal department and agency roles and responsibilities in this arena. So I think it is a helpful read to everyone to see how the funding agencies work, what our roles and responsibilities are in this area, and how those complement but differ from the roles of those, for instance, in law enforcement, what the role of Department of Education is. That's all outlined in this NSPM. And it also does contain requirements such as what needs to be disclosed and why, and the requirement to establish research security programs for institutions receiving more than $50 million in federal funding. Next slide, please. There's a complementary document called Recommended Practices to strengthen the security and integrity of our science and technology research enterprise. It offers recommendations, not requirements, but recommendations that research organizations can take to protect the security and integrity of the research enterprise. And of course, that research security helps ensure international collaboration and the criticality of foreign contributions. And it encourages research organizations to take initiative, to demonstrate organizational leadership and oversight and manage the risks that are there. I want to say that, again, we look at research organizations as partners, and we're here to help in this arena. And so we will provide any information that we possibly can to help identify and manage risks. Next slide, please. So again, this blog, and so we have a 90-day deadline. We started when the blog was released in August, and we're working through the National Science and Technology Council, NSTC, Research Security Subcommittee, which is an interagency committee that is co-chaired by OSTP, NIH, NSF, and Department of Energy. And we're working on implementation guidance. And this is guidance that is mostly for the US government agencies and how to implement NSPM 33. It also will contain helpful information, I think, for research organizations on the requirements that I'll mention in the next slide. Next slide, please. So it's going to have information on disclosure policies. We are working hard on coordinating disclosure policy among funding agencies. Jean and Michelle are co-chairing a harmonization working group where we're looking across the board at NIH and NSF disclosure requirements, working to harmonize and also explain any differences and why those do exist. And then working with the other funding agencies as they're establishing requirements to make sure that we're consistent across the board. There's been a lot of really wonderful work going on in that effort, and it'll be outlined in the implementation guidance. Oversight and enforcement. And so this has to do with being clear about potential consequences for violations. And so there's a lot of work going on in the implementation guidance effort to be as clear as possible in this consequences section. I think something that we do need to be clear about, of course, is that we want to be clear. We do have to look at, of course, the fact that there are administrative remedies that agencies take based on business risk that's presented. And then there are criminal and civil consequences. And those both are important aspects. And we try as best we can to explain those in the implementation guidance and be clear about them. And research security programs, we're hoping that in this guidance, we can be clear to you about what is going to be required in research security programs. And we understand very much the need for flexibility. So there was a community forum that I had the privilege of co-chairing with where the OSTP Director Lander and NSF Director Panchanathan both spoke. And the presidents of 7 university associations plus AAAS and the national academies were there and spoke. And then we had a roundtable discussion where we received really helpful input on what's important to the community in this implementation guidance. And we hear you loud and clear that there is the need for flexibility due to the large variety and types of research organizations that are out there. That clarity is extremely important. And we need to do as much as we can to be as clear, especially in things like consequences that might result. So we're taking that all to heart as we're coordinating this guidance. We're hoping that the guidance can be ready by November, by the 90-day deadline. We're working hard. There's some things, as you can imagine, like the coordination process, what that, we can't be really specific on the timeline for, but we're all pushing towards that deadline. And I think, is that my last slide? Yes. So now I can turn to Jean and Michelle for any additional comments.
Thank you, Rebecca. I don't really have additional comments because I think you covered the gamut of what we are moving forward to do. My only question then is, Jim and Pam, if we have questions from the community, I think that would be helpful, because I think we would do a disservice to Rebecca's presentation. She just laid it all out there.
Okay, well, first, let me thank you, Rebecca. That was great. I loved the themes of continuing to clarify around collaborations. I think that is a growing area of probably of a little bit of concern, right? You and I informally collaborate and then becomes a little bit more. And when does it become something that is more reportable than what it started as? And so I think that's really good. And there may be some questions on that. I liked your commentary on the risk-based aspects of this. If you were around for the second half of this, Rebecca, but I know Jean and Michelle will carry the flag for you. There's lots of discussion about how do institutions put in risk-based processes to determine when things become reportable and where, and how do we do this in a way that's not overly burdensome for our faculty and for the research and those types of things. And then obviously harmonization is great to hear as well. But before we get into, I do think we're starting to get a couple of questions. Jean, could you just take a moment or two to talk about the evolution of the NSF tables? I think there's a version 3 out there now, which is great to see how that's evolved, but just to talk through why you've done that and what the changes are, because I think they are new since May.
They are indeed, and it's a delight to talk to you all about the development and implementation of these tables. As many of you are aware, this isn't a new topic. We've been talking about it now for multiple years now. And NSF has evolved the language in the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide to really ensure that the language used was and is as clear as we can possibly make it. And so we have been doing that with the language in the PAP guide. And we also had, as a result of policy at nsf.gov, as a result of the 60-day comment period that we give you with any new PAP guide, we got lots of questions about that went well beyond, okay, all projects under consideration from whatever source and all ongoing projects, very, very detailed questions as a result of the implementation, the Federal Register process, et cetera. And we also note that we don't want to take full credit for it here, but our colleagues at NIH had also put out prior to us a similar kind of table. And so we felt like this was an opportunity for us, not only an opportunity for us to express something instead of 20 pages of FAQs and PAP guide language, a single resource document that could be used by not just researchers, but sponsored projects offices, by the NSF program office and our Division of Grants and Agreements. And the response that we have received has been very, very positive. Throughout this process, we also tried to be incredibly cognizant of administrative burden. Before we started this session, I was talking to my colleagues who have arranged this session, saying that we actually got comments from people who said, I think you should ask for more. And our bottom line is, well, we were trying to factor in really the administrative burden and getting the information that NSF needs. So this 3-page table, and you note that it was released in June, and we have had a couple of minor changes that we've made since that time. And the latest version is dated September 1st, 2021. And across the horizontal axis are where you would put in the proposal or post-award kinds of activities that resulted from the questions that we've received. And this again is in the hope that folks can look at it and fully understand NSF's expectations. We also added a final column called disclosure not required to let folks know. Now, I have to be very clear to you about the comment that I referred to before about organizations saying, no, I think you should provide that. NSF would say to you, if you want to make your faculty provide information that goes beyond what's in that table, that is certainly something at the discretion of the proposing institution. So one of the areas that I think I can say we spent a lot of time talking about, and that has evolved from the very beginning, is the issue of consulting. And some folks really do want to provide every consulting activity that an individual is involved in. And where we ended up on that is to provide two different ways of saying it. That if you have consulting that's permitted by your appointment and is consistent with the proposing organization's outside activities, policies, and procedures, that disclosure is not required. And that if it does fall outside of that, then you do have to disclose that as part of current and pending support. So that is really very much what the genesis of this table is, what we're using this table for. And we've also are asking both you out there in the community and our faculty members that and our program staff, if something is not on this list, to let us know about it. I also think that one thing I will also say about consulting is a point that Rebecca made. NSF does have a conflict of interest policy, which applies to any organization that has 50 or more employees, which is all of you out there. And you have requirements there on what you require your faculty members to include or to provide on an annual basis. In addition to that, we have another form, we call it collaborator and other affiliations, where folks do provide additional information that may fall in this space as well. That it is someone that you are a co-editor with, someone that you are have developed publications with in the last 48 months. So packaging all this together, and we understand it is an incredibly complex topic. I think that you'll find NSF is working very hard to ensure that we can be as clear as possible. And I'd also like to have Michelle jump in as well, even though I was asked to talk about our table, because NSF and NIH have worked very closely to do what we can to harmonize, to the extent possible, how we include this information and what our expectations are. So that's a little bit of a detailed response to that question, but I wanted everyone to understand where this came from and how we expected the information to be used by the community.
So Jean, I'm not sure that I have any more to add, to be quite honest with you. I think we've harmonized very closely. As it relates to the table, NIH has not sent out an updated table because we want to make sure that whatever we send out, it goes alongside of what the NSPM, NSTC group is doing. Exactly. So whatever Rebecca and Mike and OSTP puts out, we want to make sure that the table aligns with that. And so
that's really a good point, because it is an ending here, folks. As you all know, over the last couple of years, particularly, and I can say this with the NSF and NIH, this has evolved. if you look at where we started or what the consistency among our agency, among the, at least NSF and NIH, there were huge differences. We truly are trying to find a way to say, if there's a difference, there's a reason there's a difference. And on, for example, FCOI, yes, there is, you know, I always have to bring that up, Michelle. There are going to be differences, and that's by design, because they have other responsibilities, regulations that they have to follow. So you will continue to see not only NSS table evolve, but you will also see other agencies that are being brought to the table and being brought into this discussion in a real meaningful way.
Agreed. I will also say this too. I don't know. So as it relates to the table that NIH put out initially versus, you know, what NSF has put out, and versus what we're going to put out as a result of implementing, you know, the NSPM and NDAA. One of the things that I think is very clear to me is that we've had some thoughtful conversations amongst the federal agencies, and the leadership that we have received from Mike, Rebecca, and Aaron, OSTP, it has been phenomenal. And so what we hope to do, Jean and I, we have taken ourselves, aligned it with the leadership, and then asked for our colleagues to please present to us what their plan is. And that's the beauty of it, I think. We've not had this kind of collaboration in a way that has been extremely meaningful. And we always hear from the community, oh, well, you know, we want you guys to align yourselves. What is NIH doing? What is NSF doing? But having DOD, Ed, some of the other people at the table and really aligning ourselves that way has been different. Jean and I have spent over 20 years at least together, walking through what we would call consistency and what you guys are now calling harmonization. The challenge has been that, you know, we together, NSF and NIH, have done this alongside of others, but the commitment that I see in the leadership now is very important. And you guys may or may not be okay with the outcome. But what I will say, these discussions, the decisions, and the way we are moving forward has been very thoughtful and meaningful.
And I can honestly tell you, people are giving at the office. They're saying, you know what, I know that we previously did it this way, but I'm listening to this discussion and this need for harmonization and this concept of administrative burden, and we're taking it extremely seriously. But I couldn't have said it more beautifully and more eloquently than Michelle just did. So thanks, Michelle. And you won't hear me say that often with Michelle, so.
It's been recorded. I'm sure she's going to snip that and play it back continuously. So thank you.
Upon
Rebecca,
my retirement, Jean Feldman will go down in history. Rebecca, you have it on tape. We all have it on tape.
Rebecca, you are responding to a number of questions. If there's any of those that you think are worthy of discussion, please feel free to bring up. I was just going to ask a general question, and that is, again, later on, we're going to talk about risk-based processes to determine whether something should be reported. You know, Jean, that's a theme throughout your table, as well as Michelle's FAQs. And we talked about this a little bit before. I think in the May meeting, we jokingly said, hey, when we were young kids, as long as you showed your math in your math problem, even if you got it wrong, you got a little bit of credit if you wrote down the process. You know, I think, you know, consulting is defined differently at every institution or many institutions. Collaboration is. There's There's risk perspectives that we're all applying. There's probably different countries, different foreign countries that one might think we should or should not treat differently. There's a million different variations. You know, could you talk a little bit about how institutions should document their decision? And if they interview a faculty, have a conversation with a faculty and say, you know what, at this moment in time, it's not reportable. Now, it might change 3 months from now. And Rebecca, to your point, it might be an Article 38 post-award reporting issue, but right now it's not. Could someone just talk a little bit about what your expectations are for institutions, and particularly from ultimately an enforcement perspective, if we make the wrong decision in the documentation?
Jean, do you want to start?
Well,
Yeah.
Here's the ironic thing, based on, particularly as it relates, and Rebecca can follow on after that, with what we're seeing with these terms and condition, is she actually made the statement. She made the statement that we're not talking clerical errors. We're not talking inadvertent omissions. We're more looking at patterns, more looking at issues that, and we've found these, where they will make a statement or not provide information that is easily identifiable when you go out and look at any publication search that's out there. So
Right.
that to us is a focus area in terms of ensuring. We're really working hard to ensure that institutions understand that that risk portfolio that you do is no different than all kinds of other risk portfolios that you're going to have to do as a result of 2 CFR 200, which is a risk-based risk management document itself. And I don't think that the expectations are greater, more or less, based on this situation as well. Rebecca, you want to follow on with that?
Yes, I agree completely. And what I hope will be helpful is we're working on a website right now that has specific case examples, of course, with names and institutions redacted, that elaborate a bit on the kinds of things where we needed to take administrative action. And I think that that's going to be very illustrative of the kinds of things that are of most concern. An example I'll give you is that a PI we found out was accepting funding from another entity for the same time period where he was collecting summer salary funding from NSF. And so he didn't disclose that he was receiving this other funding to NSF or his home institution, and so was the equivalent of double dipping. Of course, that's an issue of concern. And so you can see why that would be. And those are the kinds of things that are certainly of concerning to us. We want to make sure that we're very clear about that. And I also just want to offer, anytime there's any question about that, about what needs to be disclosed, or whether something that you find out after the fact might be concerning or not, just ask us, and we're happy to talk about it.
That's
And
great.
I'm going to
Michelle,
jump in
anything to
for
add?
NIH just to say that, and I think we've tried to be very clear that the idea of being punitive is not on the table. It's not on the table. But that the idea of addressing non-compliance is on the table. And that's our responsibility. We cannot any longer, once you know that something is not clear or has not been made available, disclosed to an entity or to the federal government, we have to address it in a way that makes it very clear, and the standard needs to be set. And so for NIH, and I would imagine for any other federal grant-making agency, we have to be able to identify the non-compliance, address the non-compliance, and it's not punitive actions, it's our responsibility. as federal employees, just like it's your responsibility for your institution. And what we're saying is these are things that have always been on the table. And so maybe it hasn't been so clear in the past, but we are addressing it now, making it clear, engaging with our partners, which is of the utmost importance to, I know, NSF and NIH. And so for us, we want to make sure that the information that's provided is provided timely, accurately. And if it's not, let's work to make it right. And if we can't make it right, we need to do something different to protect you and us. These are audits. These are things that we cannot get around. And if OIG is coming in saying these are things that you need to deal with, or if law enforcement is coming in saying, what are you guys doing? The science is critical, and not addressing the issues is even more critical. And so I think we have to just be careful about that.
I mean, I think
Well
you're going to
said.
find without in our term and condition, things fall into 3 categories. Things fall into, oh, yep, you're right, inadvertent. But guess what? We also have a process to ensure that they all go through Rebecca so that a second set of eyes is looking at it as well. Oh, actually, second category, there is duplication here. What are we going to do with it, and how are we going to deal with that? And then a much rarer, but does happen, is this fraud, waste, and abuse, in which case we report it to the IG. So we're looking, there is a spectrum of answers here. And we actually are looking to you, to the institution, to help us answer some of these questions. And is there overlap or duplication? No. Okay. Does the individual have the capacity to care? Yes. And it's like, the more you can help us help you, I think is also
That's very fair, Jean.
that. I mean, I think that's something
Well
that
said.
really is helpful.
Yeah, well said.
Great comment. Pamela, I think you had a question?
Yeah, a couple. One was, Jean, you were talking a little bit earlier about being able to use publications to detect that there is something awry. And I wanted to talk just for a second about the difference between using those prospectively and using those when you have an inkling that something might be awry. I haven't heard or haven't had the sense that NSF or NH for that matter expects us to prospectively do publication reviews to determine whether or not there seems to be something. It's when we react to something where we've found out something doesn't.
I'm glad
right.
you made that point. And we also want to make very clear, at the present time, NSF is very clear in the PAP guide, at least for us, I'm not speaking for any other agency. We use biographical sketch, we use current and pending support for 2 reasons. We're very transparent about that. We use it for, does the individual have the capacity to carry out the information, to carry out the project as proposed, and is there any overlap or duplication? That's at least the current and pending support. And we're very clear about that. And so we're not talking about you going in and going, okay, there is a listing out there. And many institutions make the faculty put their information in a system. We're going to make sure you go through each and every one of these every single time and make sure, you know, that's just not an expectation that we've established here. The consulting, Jim Luther asked, and Pamela, oh my gosh, it says it's got to be in accordance with the policies and procedures of the organization and within their appointment. Are you establishing an entirely new review process? That was not our intention either. So, you know, you're asking absolutely the questions, very good ones, and ones that we need, and it's vital that we be as transparent as possible about what information we ask for, what our expectations are, and how we use that information.
In our dialogue with you about these topics has been so incredibly valuable, so that misinterpretations of
Yes.
what of intent doesn't get off and running, and people think they have to do something they don't have to do. Rebecca, can I ask you to go back? Kim Moreland asked a really good question in the chat or in the Q&A about after the 90 days, how long it will be before the results are released to the recipient community. And I think everybody is going to be interested in that answer. So could I ask you to do that orally as well?
Sure, absolutely. So we intend to release the guidance, implementation guidance publicly as soon as it's done with interagency review. So it's going to be released within the government and to the public simultaneously. The format of the release is not 100% clear yet. We're anticipating that it's going to look like an NSTC report. They have a report format, and it'll be out there. We want to emphasize that it's guidance that then we're hoping we can follow up with outreach to get specific questions and inputs on what is released. So it'll be the beginning of a dialogue. If there are any specific deadlines, they'll be listed in the implementation guidance, like guidelines for the establishment of a research security program, et cetera, et cetera.
And to the extent possible, not extent possible, we will also tell you to the any changes that we make as soon as it's released, and the timing is very important here. We also plan to incorporate those into the draft 2023 version of the PAP guide, so that you will have an opportunity to see not only, okay, you will have seen the implementation guidance document, but what NSF is doing with it and how it plans to implement those requirements. In particular, things like NDAA 2021 section 223 and the certification requirement for individuals. So you will have an opportunity to not only see, okay, here's what NSPM implementation guidance looks like, and here's what the NSF implementation guidance looks like, and have an opportunity to comment on how you think we've done that.
I wanted to emphasize that too, because there was a question, and anything, of course, that's going to be put into the PAPG 2023 will be released for public comment. So there'll be that opportunity.
100%.
So a couple of quick questions. I think we have about 5 more minutes. Rebecca, I know you need to drop, so drop when you need to, but thank you as always so much for your help. But we'll just fire some questions here in the remaining minutes. There was a question about, is having a Chinese talent program consultancy limiting to an investigator's ability to obtain NIH funding in the future? Does an agency retain this information for future determination of funding? So if I have a relationship with a Chinese talent program, does that limit my ability, or is it just a matter of disclosure? Does it limit my future ability? Any comments? Michelle or otherwise? So did you hear my question?
So I did hear your question, but you posed it to Rebecca, and I'm about to send you a text asking, why are you posing NIH questions to Rebecca?
No, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't want to answer
Rebecca. I was
Sure.
thanking Rebecca for her comments, but no, Michelle, first to you on that one.
Okay, so let's go back, because I was moved in a different.
Certainly. Is having Chinese talent consultancy, Chinese talent funding, some 1,000 talent program, is that limiting to my ability to get a grant in the future, or is it just a matter of transparent reporting? And does it impact future reporting?
So that, Rebecca, I don't even think that's an NIH question. I think that's a question across the federal spectrum.
It is.
But we'll answer it because clearly NIH has taken some hard lines on it, right? And so I'm assuming that the question is for us because of how we handle it. Anytime you don't disclose, whether domestic or foreign, we will take non-compliance actions or work with the institution to make sure that you are in compliance. That's a very easy, simple answer. We are not
It's not disqualifying.
targeting.
You're not
Right?
disqualifying.
No.
Okay.
No.
There
Okay.
is no law right now.
No.
However, there is
But Jean,
draft
for NIH, I
legislation.
just want to speak for NIH. That is not the issue. The issue is more about not
Non-compliant.
disclosing.
Right, right.
Got it. Great.
It's the
Okay.
same with us,
Now-
but as Jean was saying, there is draft legislation out there that may change things about, association with a foreign government talent recruitment program. We're all watching that. But as of right now, if it is disclosed, it will not prejudice any future funding.
Great. Thank you. Quick question again for you, Michelle. We're approaching October. There's a big deadline for NIH in January of 2022. Probably every university and research institution is doing training, doing technology changes and so forth. Do you expect to communicate material aspects of this in the coming months
Yes.
prior to January?
Absolutely. And we'll start to put that, and actually we should add that to our NIH grants policy update, that we do have a virtual seminar that's scheduled for November 1st through the 4th, where we will be doing virtual training, having it recorded, and then having time for us to do a Q&A.
Great. Pamela, any last questions before we there's some great questions in here, Jean and Michelle, I have to say. We'll summarize all these. There's one about gifts. There's more about consulting. There's some about, ethnic bias and determining different types of things. Great questions. So we will, David, if you can help us capture all that, we will get that to Michelle, Jean, and Rebecca, and we'll get some responses back out.
And we'll put the answers along with the session summary on the FDP website.
That's great. So I think now, Pamela, we move to part two.
Yes.
But Michelle and Jean, we ask that you stay as long as you can, participate in this. We'd love to get your thoughts as we go through this.
Yes. So, David, can we go back to the slides? Thank you. So please let me know if the audio problems continue. I've switched to phone and see if that might help with it. So as I said at the beginning, we want to talk about two working groups that the FDP Foreign Influence Working Group has put together. And the first one is about a concept called Key Investigator Clearinghouse. Next slide. So you will remember in that all-important August 10th post from Dr. Landers, one thing that was embedded right in that was this concept of perhaps there might be a simple modular uniform system that functions like the concept of an electronic CV, and that could be used for this kind of purpose. Well, as it happens, next slide, FDP was already thinking about this as well, and so you can see there that we identified this challenge that we have. We expanded it a little bit because we were talking about other support, we're talking about BioSketch, and we're also talking a bit about conflict of interest, although not conflict of interest that might be particular to an individual institution or state. And so we started thinking about, could there be some kind of a national online repository that would serve as a single point of data entry for investigators relative to all of this information, and then perhaps that data could be authorized by the investigators to be harvested both by agencies and by institutions. And so we are in the process of exploring that concept. Next slide. So you can see here all of the members of the working group of this, and interestingly enough, and I need to add one more, we are just delighted that Jean has agreed to personally join this group as well, and that is just so appropriate given that she is really the mother of the common biosketch, and has been for, Jean, I don't want to think how long that has been. Do you remember when you started working on it?
Since 1996.
Okay. So, yeah. So, 25 years later, we'll get it done, basically. And so, but this is also something that has gathered interest. Rebecca actually turned us on to this concept that also AAU and other organizations are interested as well. So you can see the people right now that are leading this working group, and Lori Schultz, who's going to talk here in a minute, is the chair of this group, and she is just very ably leading us on to work this issue in a very fast and a very intense kind of a way. Next slide. So the partners for this have broadened, thanks to Rebecca getting us involved, because it turns out that AAU was having this exact same idea. And so we have Dr. Landers, we have AAU, and then these are other organizations that were already having conversations in exactly the same space. And so FTP has joined as well with that. And so what Lori is going to share here next is a little bit about what we've done so far and the very aggressive timeline that we're all on. Next slide. Lori?
Thank you, Pamela. So we, as Pamela mentioned, we are moving forward really aggressively. Aside from the 90-day time frame, which is no longer 90 days since we're well past August 10th, we have a lot of really interested stakeholders in getting some kind of a solution defined very, very quickly. So we are meeting weekly, working through this problem, defining what it looks like, and also a little bit what it doesn't look like. So that group, that's the members of the group, meets on a weekly basis. We also meet with a larger group with the AAU and APLU and COGA representatives on a bi-weekly basis. We are working with AAU to solve some of the more complex problems. I think most of us that are involved in this space, looking at biosketches, looking at other support pages, looking at current and pending support, we know what the data elements are. We know what they look like. We know the format. But some of the things we don't know about how this repository could work is who hosts it, what are the legal implications there. So AAU is gathering their group of counsel to help answer some of those questions around what are the issues related to hosting, what are the issues that might come up related to public records requests or Freedom of Information Act requests around this off the ground once we have something defined. So where we are in the conversation is that could we do this as an FDP demonstration with scalability? And scalability meaning we need it to work for a school as like mine and smaller institutions as well as larger institutions. And I wrote myself a note as Dr. Kaiser was talking, what does this mean for scaling to the research security program that'll be guidance provided for institutions with more than $50 million in federal funding? Like, what does that look like in terms of scalability from small recipients to larger recipients who will be following those research security program guidelines? We want to be able to get information wherever we can that's freely available by APIs, and maybe also push information out from the system that is really not very well defined right at this moment. But our way of trying to figure out how to reduce burden is making use of the data that already exists instead of asking people to re-enter things over and over again. And then we were talking about what does it mean to have the PI validate or the institution validate, or a little bit of both, depending on, so sort of where we are in the situation. If the PI provides the information and certifies or asserts that it is correct, what is the institution's responsibility to do the same? And how does the institution see, and the federal agency as well, see where that information came from? So that's one of the things that we are trying to resolve. Next slide, please. And so where we are now is defining and documenting high-level objectives. mapping the required data elements to existing sources, like where do they come from now, where do they live now, figuring out our barriers and challenges. And a lot of the barriers and challenges are frankly those bigger questions. Who hosts, what are the legal implications, what does maintenance look like over time? And then figure out where we need additional clarity and harmonization. I mean, we've all been hearing and using that word over and over again, but the extent that we can get a system to crosswalk or i.e. harmonize some of the things that are common or similar from different federal agency requirements will be ideal. So some of our next steps are that we are meeting with ORCID next week. We're trying to figure out what are other sources of information that are freely available via API to this proposed system. And here we are today for our FDP meeting update. We expect to have a white paper by the end of October on the system. And then in working with the AAU, figuring out for January what our deliverable will look like. Next slide, please. And last but not least, this is just one look at what's happening. You know, a lot of this is figuring out what goes where and where it comes from, what an on-light system might look like to gather this information. And, you know, some of the larger questions as well. We talked about validation, certification, but we're also having conversations about what does authentication and authorization look like for this kind of information so that researchers, institutions, and agencies have access to the right information at the right time. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim and Amanda.
Thanks, Laurie. That was fast. As Pamela mentioned, this is going to be both of these presentations are going to be really quick. The objective is to kind of introduce these things. Next slide, David. So as we mentioned earlier, a lot of the discussion is risk-based. We've had lots and lots of discussion about the little diagram on the left, the connecting the dots. So now the idea is we have some of those dots, and Amanda and I wanted to present two different tools that will likely be used together to help take a risk-based approach to these items. And to help both the institution and the faculty member ideally understand how to address these issues. Next slide, and Amanda, it's all yours.
Okay, thank you. So the Transparency Working Group that was working under the COI committee had started with one format of tool and determined that it wasn't really going to be useful to scale. So what we ended up doing was taking a totally different approach and thinking about things from a faculty perspective. And one thing that we really wanted to do was organize a table that was kind of structured by activity, thinking about how faculty members might come to a table and say, well, I'm collaborating with someone or I'm working on a publication with someone, that they could look for that activity kind of on the left-hand side and then find out some more detail about this kind of activity. You might just be able to put in your NSF COA table, or it doesn't require disclosure. This kind of activity, you may want to reach out to your institution, et cetera. So our goal was really to help faculty understand where they maybe need to just quickly disclose something or put it out there somewhere, maybe where they need to pause, talk to the institution because this seems to be a larger obligation that they're taking on, and help to frame some of those questions or bucket those. And this will dovetail with the disclosure tool that Jim is going to highlight. And really, we think that the differentiation between the two is that the disclosure tool is going to provide guidance that supports kind of the compliance and institutional perspective, whereas we're hoping this will kind of support the faculty perspective and get them to the right offices and right places and right documents. Next slide, please. So this is just a very, very draft look at the table that we have been playing around with. And you can see here on the left, there's an example of publications. And then things like if it's purely advisory, you know, you're not being included as a co-author. That's really not something that rises to a level where we're going to need a full disclosure of that. And same down below for editorial service and peer review. We have a number of other pages with different types of activities, but just wanted to give everyone a sense of some of the ideas that we were putting out there to organize this information to help faculty members understand their obligations. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jim. Thank you.
Thanks, Amanda. Next slide. And this is Amanda's work group, a great collection of people. I want to certainly thank them. Next slide. So as Amanda mentioned, the one tool that she just reviewed works nicely with what we're about to discuss here. And again, it's all about a risk-based perspective. As we have talked about over the years, the agencies strive to give us FAQs and guidance and regulations and tables and so forth that we then can utilize our institutional and policies and procedures and make appropriate risk-based determinations. And ideally have internal controls that drive that consistently so that we're transparent in a consistent manner. That's what these two tools are about. Next slide. So again, this is formatted exactly the same as Amanda's. And so this intended audience is probably research administrators. I put a question mark there because it might be used broader, but in Amanda's slide, hers was more focused from a faculty perspective. This is organized by characteristic. So what are the characteristics or the element of the activity? Not what is the activity, but if there is an activity, what are those elements? And that'll make sense here in just a minute, or characteristics. And then again, ultimately, this is to help the institution and the faculty member understand what should be reported to the sponsor. Next slide. So I know that you can't read the details on the right-hand side. My next slide will show some examples, but the table or the matrix is broken into, hey, if your activity looks like this and smells like this, it's generally reportable. If it has other characteristics, then it requires evaluation. You might go to your research integrity officer. You might go to your compliance officer. You might go to your chair's office. You might go to counsel, and they would help you evaluate, is it reportable or not? And then the third element is it's generally not reportable. And Rebecca would like to hear that in that, collaborations, for example, are generally not reportable as an example. And then again, as we've talked earlier, all of this would be something that supports the documentation of the decision, so that if a year from now you receive some communication from NIH or NSF to say, hey, we have a question about this individual, ideally you have the documentation of what's the process you went through to make the decision about whether you did or did not report it. Next slide. And so this is structured based around that fundamental question. So if a faculty member has any activity, and that activity has a characteristic that could impact the funding decision by a sponsor, whether it's real or apparent, and it could impact integrity of research or overlap, then generally it's reportable. So again, a very broad, if it impacts the funding decision, the integrity of the research and or overlap, then generally it's reportable. And that's kind of how this is structured. As I mentioned before, it's about supporting the critical role of documentation in this process. And then these are just some of the sample questions. You know, does the activity meet the definition of research? So again, if you are consulting or you have an outside appointment or you have an outside relationship and it looks like research based on your definition or I think in this case, this is NIH's definition, then that is a characteristic that you should evaluate from the standpoint of whether it's reportable or not. And I won't go through the rest of these just in the interest of time, but is there a publication or authorship? Things like, are there cash payments or foreign bank accounts? That might be a characteristic that requires evaluation and discussion with counsel or someone else. So that's the nature and the structure of that document. And as Pamela mentioned, Laurie mentioned, and Amanda mentioned, all of these are very much work in process documents and processes that we're working on in the coming days, weeks, and months, and we'll share more and get more input from the community. Next slide. And this is the working group members. from a wide selection of institutions. There is some deliberate overlap with some of the foreign influence working group and the KIC group, just to make sure that we're aligned, as well as Amanda's transparency tool. So I think that's, Pamela, I think that's all we have on this. I'm not sure if we have any questions that have come up, but we'd be happy to answer any questions. Would also be happy if Michelle and Jean had any comments, positive or negative, about what they've just seen. Unless they're negative.
Maybe we
Any
should start
thoughts?
with that too.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So any thoughts on that, Michelle and Jean?
I mean,
Not looking for an
conceptually,
endorsement.
we've been
Yeah,
behind this concept for decades in terms of trying to find a way to relieve the administrative burden of a faculty member who has to change the to the because they are submitting from one agency to another. All I will say is that one has to understand that something like this, brilliant idea, a lot of work to be done, but it will take time, because at the present time, it's really going to, just like it's going to make major changes to your systems, guaranteed it's going to mean major changes to ours as well. Just the only thing I have to lay out there as an obvious, I'm sure you all already know that, but I'm excited to work on it further.
Michelle, any comments either on the clearinghouse or kind of a risk-based approach to kind of coming to the right answer with regard to reporting?
I do believe strongly that we have to have a risk-based approach. The challenge there then becomes, we need to identify a set of standards, and through implementation of a set of standards, I think we can get there. I think what we've done for the last year or more is to address things in a way that we believe, because monitoring and compliance has become very different now. And so we've tried to address things in a way that aligns with the regulatory compliance requirements, but I don't know that we have come up with a risk-based approach. And maybe the risk-based approach is some of the things that we're doing now in our implementation practices, but I'm not sure that that's even, I just can't even say that that's the right thing, right? I just think that we just need to continue, and glad to have Jean leading and being a part of this, because honestly, I think what we need to understand is what is the next best way for NIH and the other agencies to address some of these challenges. And I'm just not sure we have that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're
I
two
think that's a good
distinctly
point.
different things. We've got this whole concept of this one size fits all profile in the sky. And then you have well, what's the risk base associated with what should be reported? And so I think that, this is the first time I'm seeing some of these slides. So we'll look forward to more.
Yeah, that's the everyday challenge, Jean, as you can imagine, right? I mean, if you bucket activities like you did before into 3 buckets, things that are clearly inappropriate, illegal, bags of cash, foreign accounts, we may not know about them as administrators, but when we find out about them, we don't need to ask any questions. That's very easy.
Amen.
Right? And then there's things on the other side of the spectrum that are collaborations and sharing data and all the things that we want to do. But the problem is the gray in the middle is about 80% of it, right? And
As
so
with
every
everything
day,
we do in this line of work.
That's right. But every day we're asked questions from the faculty. Hey, it looks like this and it smells like this and it tastes like this. What do you think I should do? And our goal is to try to, yeah.
When in doubt,
report.
Yeah.
It's not been the
Yeah.
issues of the people that have reported too much. Oh gosh, we're gonna look at that
Sure.
person, they gave us too much. It's, oh, wait a minute, I happen to know this person has a grant from X and it's not on here. There you
So
go.
here's a question for you,
So-
Jane. Here's a specific question.
Hold
That-
on,
Yeah, go ahead,
Michelle
Michelle.
wants to say something.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I
No,
jumped in.
please, Michelle, and then we'll ask the specific question that came up about
So there-
being an editor.
Yeah, so there was a question that came in from Pam. And Pam, you asked if I could answer this one live, follow-up question for NIH. Would NIH consider issuing proposed new guidance for comment prior to implementation? I didn't see it in the Q&A, but if you want to speak to it and tell me what the actual question is, or if this is the question, I can answer that.
I think what that's referring to, Michelle, is Jean said that at the end of the 90-day period, the new guidance that will be formulated will go, as it relates to NSF, will go out in the PAP guide for comment as part of their normal process. And I believe the question was associated with NIH. Is there any equivalent process that will be used where NIH can get input from the stakeholder community about changes that are proposed?
So I think this has come up with the COGR community and with our colleagues here probably. And one of the things, Jean, stop smiling. Okay.
Sorry.
So one of the things that we're doing, so we haven't done any updated guidance thus far. We do have the NIH grants policy statement coming out. I have talked to leadership about providing an opportunity for our community colleagues to see the significant changes table prior to implementation. It may take some time because when we receive the comments, we do want to take a look at them. And I want to make sure that folks understand that even in the midst of reviewing the comments, if we have to stop and take a moment to justify, why we are accepting the comments or not, we're happy to do that. The challenge then becomes the implementation, and that's totally fine. We are happy to do that. Mike Lauer has been very supportive of this approach. And we've had some lessons learned with regard to this, and just being able to capitalize and leverage some of the comments that have come into NSF and the PAP guide. So we certainly hear you, and that is the plan. We do know that it's going to delay it, but we're okay with that. But we also want the community to understand too, that if there's a law, regulation, statute requirement that we need to do something, we may not be able to address those comments. And so I just want to put that out there in a very transparent way.
That makes perfect sense, Michelle. I mean, I think sometimes there's flexibility in terms of how it gets implemented, but it has to be implemented. And in other cases, it's so crystal clear what, like if there were to be legislation that said, thou shalt not be a member of a foreign talent recruitment program, other than maybe some definitional things, it's going to be super clear. But
and it might not be super clear, but what we have to do as federal agents is to protect the federal funding. And so in that space, unfortunately or fortunately, Pam and colleagues, it might not be that clear. And so that's the piece that I think you all have to understand and give NIH the same space and grace that we give NSF and others.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to make a comment about foreign talent for us. First of all, it's challenging because it's a moving target. You preclude, you say you can't do one, and then they just call it something different, or go from it being governmental to being a not-for-profit kind of concept where it's really funded by the government. But the more important point to make is that there are all kinds of talent programs. And there's really the maligned, the ones that, you know, really do have issues. And that's what the Hill is addressing right now. And then there are the ones that we see all the time and are very positive and would definitely look positively if an individual was engaged in one of those programs. So it's a very, very complex topic, and
Great point.
we're just still not there yet.
And Jean, that's such a great point. And I think you've both pointed out in the past, and I think the community agrees, that it's not necessarily the involvement in the program, it's what is involved when you are in the program.
That's right. That's right.
Poses the challenge. And so we're addressing the actual challenge rather than the appearance or the name associated with
And
it.
for those that were in the very, very early days and did the 1,000 talents, I mean, there were requirements that said, that put them between a rock and a hard place, because we said disclose, and what they signed said you may not disclose unless you get our permission, in which case they would never get the permission. So we've learned a lot since those early days. The numbers I've seen are anywhere from it started with 1, and now there are 200 to 300 in one country alone. So again, there's still work to be done on this.
Right, and it's no longer, as you pointed out, the 1,000 talent programs, it's the 999 talents program.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
So one quick question, Jean, that I started. It's related to, the question is, where does this leave faculty who are editors? They probably have a contract with a publisher that's reportable, ? And are involved in the review process of dozens of manuscripts every year.
Well, number one, this may be an area I feel guilty about, because it really could be potentially duplicate reporting, and I hate that. But you do have to report editors, co-editors on journals in your collaborator and other affiliations. In another perspective, many consider that to be a professional appointment, and it would be included in the bio sketch. So it's that's something that I'm taking back to our folks, because I really, really do. We use collaborator and other affiliations for a totally different purpose. It doesn't go to reviewers at all. It's used to help manage and select reviewers to avoid conflicts of interest. But the other spot is in the biographical sketch as a professional appointment. Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question.
Pamela, are there any other, thank you, Jean. Are there any other questions, Pamela?
Well, I know we're pretty much out of time, so maybe I could just reiterate that this session has probably had more active Q&A than I have seen, which is fantastic. So some were answered, some weren't. Some were answered just for the person who asked. So we're going to take all of those, and we're going to package them. And as I said, we will send out ones that we didn't have a chance to get to Rebecca, Jean, and Michelle, and get their input on those. And then we'll package all that up and put it on the FDP site along with this presentation. If that's okay with everybody.
Thanks, Pamela. And I'm sure you'll do the same, Pamela. I just wanted to thank Jean and Michelle and Rebecca. I mean, you all never fail to come to this group and get asked the hard questions, whether it's in person or through the chat. I know this takes a lot of time from you and your staff, and we appreciate it, because I know as an administrator, and when I talk to faculty, I feel like sometimes they don't appreciate the perspective I'm coming from. I think it's important for all of us to appreciate the perspective that you're coming from, which is pressure from the NDAA, pressure from Dash 33, pressure from members of Congress, pressures from Dr. Collins and Dr. Ponch. There's a lot going on. So we appreciate your continued focus on harmony. We ask that you continue to support these discussions, because it's really meaningful for you and your staff.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.